very pleased to see you here tonight. I want to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. The Castan Centre has had a very long relationship with the law firm Holding Redlich, going back to 2001. And they have long sponsored these visiting academic fellowships, which has enabled us to have a lot of great visitors over the last 16 years. It's a relationship for which we are extremely grateful, and there's not much more I can say about that. It's been a wonderful partnership for a long time. So I'm going to hand over to Guy Donovan, who is the National Pro Bono Manager from Holding Redlich, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you very much, Professor Joseph. It's certainly a relationship that Holding Redlich is very proud of, the relationship with the Castan Centre for Human Rights, and it's my really great pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, who's in Australia as part of the Castan Centre's Holding Redlich Distinguished Visiting Fellow program. So please welcome Professor Kevin Washburn from the University of New Mexico to deliver what will no doubt be a fascinating lecture on the topic of American Indian tribal nations and the transition from Obama to Trump. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be here, and I'm grateful to Sarah and the staff of the Castan Center and to Holding Redlich for bringing me out. What I thought I would do is give you a little bit of, you all are dealing with issues in Australia, dealing with Aboriginal issues that are very, very important, and I'm not going to propose to be an expert in that, and you don't need an American coming to Australia to tell you how to do things. But what I did want to give you a sense is how this all works in the United States, and I thought that just introducing you to tribes generally in the United States and kind of what's happened in the last 8 years under the Obama administration, and then what we're looking forward to in the Trump administration. Maybe looking forward isn't the right way to characterize that, but what we expect, or the signals that the Trump administration is handing out. So that's how this is going to go. I'm actually a law professor, so if you have questions in the middle of my talk at any time, raise your hand high, and I'm happy to talk about that. I mean, please don't hesitate to interrupt me, because I'd much rather be talking about things that you want to be talking about than a bunch of slides on the page just for the sake of that. So, I served in the Obama administration for the second term, and worked a lot with Indian tribes. So I know a lot about this at this moment in time, more than I ever have and I ever will. But I also teach Indian law, federal Indian law. And by the way, everybody I have talked to today or yesterday raised this issue of the question of the word Indian. And I gather that it may be offensive to some people in Australia. It's not really offensive to people that live on Indian reservations in the United States. There are 5 volumes of the United States Code that say Indians on the spine. And lawyers use the term every day. They have to in court. And so Native American is becoming a more common term, but we don't call ourselves Indians and we don't call ourselves Native Americans. We tend to call ourselves by the name of our tribe. So I'm a Chickasaw. I'm a member of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma, and that's the way we refer to ourselves. So maybe that's why the terms aren't all that loaded for us. But at Eastern liberal arts colleges in the United States, I would probably use Native American rather than Indian as well. But on Indian reservations, we don't care so much. Before European contact, there was estimated to be up to 10 million American Indians in North America. And just in the New England part of the United States, where much of the early settlement happened, there was estimated to be about 750,000 Native Americans in around 1600. And by 1700, there were only about 7,000. And virtually none of those people were murdered. They died of disease, and some of them cleared out of the area, but most of them died of diseases and that sort of thing that were brought by the Europeans. Indian tribes across the United States are very heterogeneous. They just have utterly different cultures from one another. And I am fond in the United States of explaining that, a Texan is much more similar to someone from Massachusetts or Oregon than one tribe's members are to another tribe's members. That really pisses off people from Massachusetts or Oregon when I compare them to Texans. But it's really the truth. I mean, tribes are so much more different. Oregonians and Texans basically have a common language. But tribes, speak many different languages, and they've got very different cultures and different diets and different ways that they live. The picture on the right is the apartment buildings, if you will, that the Pueblo Indians in New Mexico live in. Alaska, some of the Alaska tribes, the people live in Eskimo, in igloos. But it varies from these, grass huts, grass homes to teepees. I think the iconic thing is the teepee, but actually it was really only a handful of Plains tribes that actually used teepees. It wasn't very many tribes. The Navajo Nation, which is one of the biggest tribes with one of the biggest reservations, they live in a round, octagonal-shaped home called a hogan, that the doorway always points towards the rising sun, points towards the east. And so it just varies dramatically how tribes live. And again, it's part of the heterogeneity is what I'm trying to show you here. There's a myth that, the West was won, that tribes were conquered by the United States. And that's not really true. The United States treated with tribes throughout the 19th century and frankly the 18th century before that, as did the Crown, mostly because they couldn't afford to conquer the tribes. They couldn't afford to defeat them in war, in battle. And this was a policy started by the Crown in the Proclamation of 1763. This is one of the reasons that the colonies broke away from England, because of the Proclamation of 1763, in which the king said, settlers cannot settle west of the Appalachian Mountains on the East Coast, because you can't keep starting these wars that we don't have the resources to finish. And so we were prohibiting settlement. And so the colonies broke off from England. And the first thing that the new Congress did once it was established was basically adopt the Proclamation of 1763 as the law, because the very young United States could not afford to fight these battles either. And so it prohibited settlement on Indian lands, basically. So, the idea of conquest is an utter myth. Usually there was lots of negotiation, and certainly it was sometimes negotiation under duress, but the tribes negotiated for everything that they still have, and included hundreds of treaties, but other statutes and other ways that tribes gave up or ceded their lands. People in the United States sometimes ask me, why is it that we force these Indians to remain on Indian reservations? And people that say that have it backward. The reservation is it's a real estate term, it's a property term in the United States. You reserve the things that you didn't cede away. And so this is what the tribes have reserved. It's not the United States that created reservations, it's the tribes that reserved the land. It's them reserving all their rights to a certain amount of land when they made cessions of other lands. So, people even a lot of Americans don't really understand that. But the tribes did cede a lot of lands, and so this slide gives the cessions over time. And by 1990, the red spots on the map are quite small. But over the course of time, it's just from the 1850s to 1990. But much of that land in the 1850 slide was recognized as owned by tribes by treaties by the federal government, and over time it was negotiated away. So today it's the lands and the 1990 version, which is still about nearly 60 million acres of land that tribes own. And here's another slide. There are 567 recognized tribal nations in the United States. I used to joke with John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State, that I was getting screwed because he only had 180 odd countries that he had to negotiate with, and he had a much larger budget. The tribes, obviously, you can see from this map, they do have a significant land base. It's a lot of land that they continue to own or control. And together with public lands, you can see why there's a lot of issues in the United States around public lands generally, because this map shows the public lands. It doesn't so much show the, well, it does. It shows the native lands in green, but it also shows other public lands. So throughout the West, a lot of people are really angry because Uncle Sam really owns much of the land in the western United States, and it's not so much in the East Coast. And so the Westerners think it's kind of unfair that the government owns all the land out west, and the Easterners get to own their own land, in essence. So there's real tension in the United States around that. Today's Native Americans are really subject to climate change and that sort of thing. Tribes live in the most vulnerable places. They live in the hottest parts of the country, where the need for water is the greatest, and they live in the coldest parts of the country that are melting. Literally, the land beneath the Native Alaskans' feet is melting from under them, and many of them live on ice, and their villages are falling into the sea. And it turns out it's really, really difficult to move entire villages, partly because they don't want to move. It really takes a disaster to get them to move. During the first term of the Obama administration, a lot of effort went into helping them to develop plans to relocate. And there are very elaborate plans prepared, but it ultimately takes tens to hundreds of millions of dollars to move even villages of 1,500 people or something like that. And so it just really hasn't happened. But because of their locations and being near the sea, and in some places because they're depending on fish for their livelihood or their very meals, climate change is really affecting them in really bad ways. So they're particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. There are about almost 3 million people in the United States who list indigenous, that claim that they are native on U.S. Census forms, and it's voluntary. We don't check. We don't send someone out to verify that, but we do ask them what tribe they are, and they can voluntarily fill that in. And the U.S. Census has changed, so it now allows people to list more than one race, and so 6.6 million people claim to be native and some other race. I would claim to be native and white. I'm a member of an Indian tribe, but the federal government has issued me a card that has my blood quantum, and by blood quantum, I'm only 1/8 Native American. In my tribe, that's enough to be a full citizen. So I am politically, a Native American. I'm a Chickasaw, but I'm also obviously white as well, and so I would be in the second category. I would claim to be solely Native American. Much of what I've shown you is, the rural areas where Indians have lands, but actually 70% of Native Americans really don't live on Indian reservations. They've been moved to urban areas. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, the federal government, had a very important Indian policy called the Urban Relocation Program in the 1950s. It was a very elaborate policy. What they did was they bought a bus ticket and gave an Indian $200 and said, move to the city. And so they bought bus tickets to Chicago and San Francisco and Los Angeles and Denver, and gave them $200, and that was the program. And I think it created a lot of homeless people in the United States. And a lot of those people eventually migrated back to their reservations, but it was an effort to, urbanize Native Americans and get them jobs. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so there's a little bit of New Mexico bias in this presentation. There are about 47,000 Native Americans living in Albuquerque. But again, it's a kind of a problem because most of our programs are based on reservation-based Indians, so they don't serve urban Indians very well, and that's a real social problem for us, that we don't serve urban Indians very well. Where I live in the Southwest, and this is the Tourism Bureau asked me to include this slide, the beautiful pictures, the landscape born, if you will. There are about 91 tribes in the southwestern United States, and including a lot of the tribes that were removed from other parts of the United States, specifically during the reign of a president named Andrew Jackson, who Trump has famously embraced, a populist that encouraged the removal of Native Americans to what was then Indian Territory and is now known as the state of Oklahoma. In New Mexico, where I live, there are 23 Pueblos and tribes, the tribes being the Navajo Nation, a couple of Apache tribes, and the Mountain Ute tribe. And here's just Arizona, New Mexico, where I live. You can see that it's quite a lot of land in the states. Yes, ma'am.
Who are Pueblos? Can you tell us if they are on there? So you said there were a number of Pueblos. What does that mean?
Sure. So, it's a great question. There are various names for different kinds of, we would call them all Indian nations or all Indian tribes. But the Pueblos are, sort of a particular variety of tribe that live in New Mexico, and they were very urban from early on. They lived in cities and they farmed outside of those cities. They lived in communally. Unlike, for example, the Apaches that were hunter-gatherers that moved all around, dragged their teepees or their with them, or the Navajos who lived in homes but not together. They lived scattered. One family would be very distant from another family, for example. But the Pueblos lived kind of in cities, and the Pueblos are they're interesting because they had early contact with the Spanish because of their location, and they have adopted Catholicism in some ways into their culture. So they have feast days, which was part of their original culture, but they're now named after saints. And so there was the famous Pueblo revolt. They revolted against the Catholics and the Spanish in 1680 and threw them out of the state. And the Catholics and the Spanish were largely gone from the state for 20 to 30 years, and then came back. But each of the types of Indian tribe have different experiences with European nations and have defined their identity in some ways. Yes, ma'am.
Pueblo in Spanish means village. So was that the original name of the people that resided in that area, or is it something that is all from the Spanish because of where they lived?
Well, I'm sure the name was given to them by the Spanish, but they've adopted it. And in fact, there's the Santa Clara Pueblo, which is that's all Spanish, right? That's not what they would have called themselves. But the Pueblo, the 19 Pueblos in New Mexico, there are 3 language groups that they use. And they've also got their original names that they sometimes use to refer to themselves. One of them is the Tiwa. But they've adopted so much of the Spanish, yet retained their own culture. They really blended in an incredible way with sort of Spanish culture. So things have really changed since really about the era of the War on Poverty and LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and the United States, and then the Richard Nixon administration. During the War on Poverty, the federal government really made efforts to, reach out to poor communities. And one of the things it did, interestingly, was to start creating grants for organizations that were going to help the poor. And it was really about self-determination. And tribes, and it was a specific effort to go around existing governmental structures like cities, because they were concerned that cities were corrupt and they would use federal money in a way that wasn't consistent with the goal of lifting people out of poverty. But they felt if they reached out to poverty organizations and actually community groups, those people would lift themselves up. And tribes very much were governments, but they sort of signed on. They were they'd become very weak governments, I guess is the way to put it at that time. In fact, they might have had 1 employee each or something like that, or maybe just a governmental structure, but not no employees. And they said, we're poor, we're organizations, fund us. And so they started getting funding during the War on Poverty and really started to establish themselves. Before that time, the only funding they ever got was from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so they really were under the thumb of the government. But when they had sort of another source of funds, they really became more independent. And they started helping themselves and started looking themselves up. And the programs at the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Health Service that served Indian tribes, a law was passed in 1975 by the Richard Nixon administration, the Congress and the Richard Nixon administration, to basically allow tribes to contract for any of the functions that the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the Indian Health Service did. And so tribes, instead of a federal employee providing these services, it would be a tribal employee. The tribe would contract with the federal government, take the money, and then hire its own staff to do this work. And that really was the beginning of modern tribal governments. And it's been fabulous. By now, there are a lot of tribal governments that have 200, 300, 400 employees to serve their people. And actually, sometimes it gets much higher than that. But we've really seen a renaissance in tribes and the authority and the sovereignty of American Indian tribes in just the last few years. Many of them are rewriting their tribal constitutions too, because they had been written in large part with the help of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they didn't necessarily reflect tribal values. Sarah?
So just to be clear, you're saying that sort of the renaissance of tribal government started under Richard Nixon?
I am. It's interesting. There's been a raging debate. There was a raging debate during the Obama administration of who was the better president for Indian tribes, Richard Nixon or Barack Obama. Interestingly, I mean, in Indian country, Richard Nixon is very popular, actually, because he believed in tribal self-determination and self-governance. Yes, sir.
And when you say tribal constitution, you trigger in my head Wall Street, Georgia, I think Cherokee Nation, 1831, domestic dependent nation. Mm-hmm. You trigger the Commerce Clause, where from day one the US Constitution recognised tribes in terms of commerce. I'm not sure. What I'm asking is this real sovereignty, independence, or some kind of domestic governance? You've mentioned you required a law of the federal Congress to enable tribes to exercise self-governing powers. Doesn't sound like sovereignty to me.
Well, it's interesting. I've had a conversation with a number of people since I've been in Australia, and the conception of the word sovereignty in Australia is that it's absolute. There is only absolute sovereignty. And that's, to me, like saying there is only absolute power. Sovereignty, to me, is just another word for power, and, there is absolute power sometimes, and of course absolute power corrupts absolutely, we've heard all that. But in the United States, we have this federal system where we've got states that have their area of sovereignty, and we've got the federal government that is actually supposed to be a government of limited powers with limited sovereignty, and it is limited in some ways because there are things where places where the federal government cannot act, the states can, and so there is. We think of sovereignty more on a sliding scale in the United States, and tribes have limited sovereignty. I would not say that they have full absolute sovereignty, but they've got many aspects of sovereignty, and in many respects where they have sovereignty is in the same kinds of areas where states have sovereignty in the United States. State governments do. And states do not tend to have jurisdiction on Indian lands. And so that creates a space, a policy space where tribes can exercise sovereignty. But the U.S. Constitution also has a clause called the Supremacy Clause that says the federal government, where it's properly exercising power, is supreme over other governments that would share that same space. And we haven't fully worked out how tribes fit into this because tribes weren't invited to the Constitutional Convention. It was a convention between the colonies that became the states and the federal, creating the federal government. And so there are really only two parties to that compact, and tribes were not invited to the table. And so we've had to make this stuff up to some degree. The courts have made this stuff up. In fact, Justice Scalia, before he died, said that to me. He said, I was introduced to him once at a party, and he said, the person that introduced me said, "You teach Indian law." And Justice Nino Scalia turned to me and said, "Wow, do you understand that stuff? We don't understand it. We just make it up as we go along." He literally said that, U.S. Supreme Court Justice.
But you've got numerous treaties that speak about sovereign governments, sovereignty.
That's right.
In different ways, I imagine.
We do. And we've got the Commerce Clause, as you mentioned. The Commerce Clause says that Congress shall regulate commerce among the states, with Indian tribes, and with foreign nations. So a lot of people have made a lot of the fact that it seems to treat tribes more like foreign nations than like states by just the mere language of it. So, but we don't know what all that means. I mean, we really have had to try to figure this out. And that our so-called founding fathers that did not think through all of this very well, honestly. I'm not sure what they anticipated might happen, but it was not fully formed. Today, Indian tribes are accustomed. This is a picture in the Roosevelt Room of the White House, meeting with President Barack Obama, an early meeting with President Barack Obama, and people come in their regalia to meet with the president. When the Indian tribes come, they often wear their regalia, and they're accustomed to having meetings with the president. Barack Obama was famously adopted by the Crow Nation when he was running for office, when he was still campaigning. He was given the name Black Eagle. He once introduced himself at a conference with a bunch of tribal leaders and said, "Is this a great country or what? A young Native American kid like me can grow up to be president of the United States." Got a great sense of humor, which you need in Indian country. But he really campaigned on the fact that he was going to serve Indian tribes well. He was going to listen to Indian tribes. That was a big campaign promise for him. He got a lot of support from Indian tribes. He ended up having 8 annual meetings that he invited all the Indian tribes in the country to. I organized about 4 of those meetings in my position, and I attended the last one as well. And my wife attended the first one, so there's 1 or 2 that I don't know too much about. But I was sort of like the father of the bride at a wedding at 4 of those. I would organize them, basically. But the president would meet with the tribal leaders, again, in an auditorium-type setting, because, a lot of them would come. It would have meetings throughout the day in which each of the cabinet secretaries would come and brief the tribal leaders. They really had access. They had direct access to the highest levers of government in the United States, and they got accustomed to that. And they raised issues during each of those meetings that the president tried to address. He didn't address all of them. Tribes can be quite demanding. We want all of North America back, for example, was a common theme. He tried to give as much as he could back to tribes. He very much believed in the trust responsibility. The United States Supreme Court, one of our early Chief Justices, John Marshall, came up with this notion that there is a trust responsibility that the United States has to Indian tribes. And the basic idea there is that, as long as we occupy North America, we owe a responsibility to the people that we took North America from. And we took North America, again, not by conquest, by promises that we didn't live up to. We claim to be just people, that we promised certain things, then we didn't live up to those promises. And so that's really the nub of the problem in the United States, is that the promises that were made have never been fully lived up to. And so it creates kind of an ongoing problem with our claims to being a just nation, honestly. And so this trust responsibility and moral responsibility continues as long as the United States continues to stay in North America.
And am I right in saying that one of the worst breaches of promises is the BIA? And indeed, hasn't there been Supreme Court decisions ordering that monies improperly are hidden away by the BIA, by the Bureau, be returned to them? Hundreds of millions, I think.
That's so the question is the BIA the biggest breach of the trust responsibility, and has the Supreme Court ordered the return of money to tribes or from the BIA or to Indian people?
I think it arose out of a mining deal.
What's that?
A mining deal that...
So you may have read some of my scholarship. Yeah, there's been some real problems over the past. The BIA had a lot of authority and sometimes abused that authority. And there, frankly, has been, the BIA is one of the oldest federal agencies. And it was originally in the War Department. It pre-existed, the department it exists in now, which is the Department of the Interior. It existed before that department. It was moved from the War Department. And you can imagine, I mean, if it was part of the War Department, its job has changed and culture's changed slowly. And over 190 or 200 years, it has changed slowly. It's gotten much better. But today, the BIA, to a great degree, is a contracting agency because about half or more of the BIA budget goes straight to Indian tribes for these contracts that I mentioned earlier. And the BIA has had problems. In the past, it was people said that it stood for bossing Indians around, but it is the part of the federal government whose job is to serve Indian tribes, and so it's not always popular, but no one wants to get rid of it really because it's so key to serving Indians. I'm going to have to speed this up a little bit. This was the last Tribal Nations Conference when Obama, just before he left office. He made a lot of promises, and let me just talk about some of the things that he delivered. In 2010, he extended felony criminal jurisdiction to tribes. He restored to tribes felony criminal jurisdiction. Up until that time, for some years, they had only misdemeanor jurisdiction, and he restored felony jurisdiction. And this is how I got on the radar screen of the Obama administration, because I had written about the need for this and about the fact that the federal government is institutionally incompetent to be prosecuting cases on Indian reservations. There's a joke that the FBI can't find their butt with both hands on an Indian reservation, and to some degree that's true. The most effective FBI agents, when they're investigating offenses, go find a tribal police officer to help them because the tribal police officers know their way around. In 2013, the president signed into law the Violence Against Women Act that restored tribal criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians for limited purposes involving domestic violence, because we've got a real sexual assault and domestic violence problem on Indian reservations. So some tribes are now exercising jurisdiction even over non-Indians for criminal offenses under limited circumstances to try to help address this very serious problem that we have in the United States. He also really began enforcing the Indian Child Welfare Act, and I helped draft the new regulations and guidelines to keep Native American children from being adopted out of their families and off their Indian reservations. And Indian people care very much about their children, and they care very much about their lands. And so this was really important to them. President Obama also directed the signing of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, the UN DRIP, we call it. And this was my deputy who went to New York when that happened. Restoring tribal lands, the president restored it rolls up to 2.5 million or more acres of land, and also allowed these lands to be taken into trust, restored to tribes in Alaska, which had never been the rule before. And Alaska is about half again the size of the whole rest of the United States. It's huge, and so that's really, really important.
It doesn't look like that at all on a map.
Well, yeah, it actually stretches from North Carolina to California if you lay it on the map, the Aleutian chain and all. It really is huge. There's a joke in Alaska. They have T-shirts that say, "Split Alaska in two and make Texas the third largest state." Pissing off Texans was something we in the United States spend a lot of time trying to do. Obviously, you can see. President Obama also increased tribal sovereignty over their own lands. And so, for example, the BIA used to be the ones to decide whether a right-of-way could be granted across Indian lands or whether lands could be leased, and that has now been restored to tribes. They have that power to do that, and this is the president signing the bill that allowed that. Rights of way is particularly important. Some of you have heard about the Dakota Access Pipeline issue, and that's been a really tough issue. And the sad thing, the thing that it has obscured that people don't realize is that during the Obama administration, we actually changed the law so that a pipeline can't be built across an Indian reservation unless the tribe agrees. The problem with the Dakota Access Pipeline from the tribe's perspective is it doesn't actually cross their land, the land, land that is still theirs. If it was built across their reservation, it wouldn't be happening because they would have a right to veto that. But we also prevented piggybacking. Railroads have rights of way across Indian reservations, and telecom companies and public utility, electric utility companies and others for years have been saying, well, there's already a right-of-way there, we're just going to piggyback on that. And we stopped that. We said, no, you have to go negotiate with the tribe if you want a right-of-way for different purposes than a railroad. We also preempted state taxation of the non-Indian businesses that are using that right-of-way. So, which is a real problem because tribes don't have a tax base. But that's just an example of one of the things that the president did. The president also settled more than $10 billion worth of litigation with Indian tribes. And it actually turns out the Supreme Court tends not to rule against the United States very often in these cases. But the president settled with tribes in cases that they may have won, but they likely would not have won in some cases. And this is very important because if tribes are looking back at the past all the time about all the injustice, it's really hard for them to look forward because they're looking and dwelling on the injustice. And so if you can address the injustice, you can help tribes look forward to a brighter future and ways to solve the problems rather than dwelling on them. And so that was a particularly important part of the Obama legacy. Funding has increased dramatically. This is really a century of funding that I've got up here on the board. But you can just see it's going up during the Obama administration with a slight blip downward during something called sequestration. Congress cut the entire federal budget by 5% 1 year, but Obama really tried to increase funding dramatically for Indian tribes and succeeded quite a bit. Numerous different developments for Indian tribes. I've got pages of this. I don't have time to talk about them, but all kinds of major accomplishments for Indian tribes during the Obama administration. Many of them technical and uninteresting, but nevertheless very important. Lots of blue ribbon commissions that were created to study different problems and report out solutions. And a lot of their proposed recommendations were adopted. Lots of legislative accomplishments. Bills that the White House pushed through Congress. Lots of accomplishments within the administration itself. Changes that we could make without going to Congress because during the second term we had a largely Republican in the second half of the second term an entirely Republican Congress. So the only changes that we could make were changes that we could do ourselves. And often over the objection of members of Congress. So a lot of major steps forward for Indian tribes, including people appointed to important positions in government and national monuments that tribes cared about, protecting lands from energy development and that sort of thing. And this one kind of drove me nuts because this is all anyone ever wanted to talk about. I had did all these incredible policy things that I thought were important, and really here the president changed the name of Mount McKinley in Alaska, the tallest mountain in North America, back to its native name, Denali. It was named after President McKinley for not a very good reason. McKinley had never even been to Alaska. He was from Ohio. But the president changed the name back, and this resonates more with Indian people than anything else the president did, even though it's a mere name change. So very important stuff. Of course, President Trump was just inaugurated January 20th, and we're trying to figure out where he is going to be on these issues. He's got the same responsibility to Indian tribes that President Obama had. I have been saying for months that I'm not sure what President Trump's going to do, but I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt because he's got a trust responsibility to Indian tribes, and until he fails to meet it, I'm not going to beat up on him. He's starting to give, this is from the whitehouse.gov webpage. I didn't choose, I chose the picture, but it's an official picture, so I'm not trying to make him look bad. But we're starting to see some issues with the things that he's doing. So, first of all, President Obama had ruled against two pipelines, the Keystone XL pipeline, which we had debated for years in the United States. President Obama ultimately denied the permits for that pipeline. Trump came in and immediately reversed that decision. The Dakota Access Pipeline, Obama ordered additional environmental review to address, to seek to address the tribe's concerns. And once again, obviously Trump reversed that decision quite right away also, and that pipeline is now operating. Obama increased federal Indian appropriations dramatically, as I mentioned to you. Trump has asked Congress to cut federal appropriations to Indian tribes by 10 to 12%, which is really significant. That's jobs that would go away in Indian country if that happened. Obama instituted a rule to capture methane gas rather than wasting it by flaring it off and causing more carbon pollution in the atmosphere. Obama has reversed that rule. Trump had indicated that he will also reverse or revisit at least Obama's rule on hydraulic fracturing. And fracking has been a big issue in the United States. It's got potential ramifications for water resources. And Obama wasn't, I don't think, being radical. He just said it ought to be regulated. It had been unregulated on federal lands before Obama acted, and Trump has ordered the Department of the Interior to reconsider that rule. Obama withdrew 115 million acres of land in the Arctic, in the Chukchi Sea and a couple of other areas of the Arctic. And Trump has ordered reconsideration of this decision and has effectively promised that it will be opened to drilling. Obama ordered power plants to cut carbon pollution by 30% by 2030. This was known as the Clean Power Plan. And Trump is really working to roll back the Clean Power Plan. He's ordered a review of that decision. He can't overturn these things just by fiat, most of them. He has to develop a record, otherwise his action will be overturned by the courts. And so that's why he's ordering reviews, so that they can consider the issues and to develop a record to overturn these, develop evidence. So if it goes to court, they've got a leg to stand on to defend. Unlike the Muslim travel ban, for example, they got their heads handed to them pretty quickly on that because they hadn't built any kind of record. And so they're trying to be a little more thoughtful about how they destroy the environment. Obama declared numerous national monuments, and Trump is reviewing all of the national monuments that are greater than 100,000 acres. And he's actually going back 21 years because that captures the key parts of the Clinton administration too, the ones that were developed by the Clinton administration. So he will potentially undo several national monuments. Trump has also signaled concerns about the very idea, that those 5 volumes of the United States Code that I mentioned to you that have the word Indians on the spine. Trump, in his signing statement to our most recent Appropriations Act, suggested that laws like that might pose equal protection and racial type issues. And so he specifically called out housing block grants, which are about $650 million a year to Indian tribes, as an example of something that might be unconstitutional in essence. And so that's giving people heartache. He does tend to say things off the cuff that are really serious, sometimes that don't seem like they've put a lot of thought into them. And this may be one of those, but it's making everybody very nervous because a hell of a lot of money is involved. So for tribes, there's a real uncertain future about what might happen next in the Trump administration. And I'm still hopeful that the Trump administration will, find ways to be good for Indian country in certain areas. But my hope is beginning to dim in some ways. What he has done a good job of is reaching out to the tribes that are producing oil and gas and coal and trying to enlist them to support him. And that's not very many of those 567 tribes. It's probably less than 10 tribes. But it clouds the issue a little bit if you've got at least a few tribes on your side. And so he has been giving access to the White House to people like that and virtually denying access to the White House to any other Indian tribe in the United States. So we're not sure what's going to happen, but there's a quick overview of what it looks like in the United States. And I would love to answer any questions. There, I did it. I kind of kept to the time. Yes, ma'am.
Do you celebrate Thanksgiving?
Do we celebrate Thanksgiving? We celebrate it in different ways, yeah. So, for example, the Pamunkey tribe of Virginia, which was unrecognized, I was able to recognize them for the first time by the federal government when I was assistant secretary. It's Pocahontas' tribe, a major figure in American history. And the Pamunkey tribe celebrates Thanksgiving by delivering venison to the governor of Virginia every year in late November. And so it's an important tradition to them, and they believe it establishes their legitimacy in some respects as a government. And so, yeah, I started my job on the Tuesday after Columbus Day. And I don't particularly celebrate Columbus Day. In the United States, we've often been, many localities and some states have changed Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day to start to have a more proper approach to some of these things. Yes, sir?
Just want to find out what extent that a trust relationship is being tested in the States. So I assume you mean like a fiduciary duty.
Yeah.
And we've had previous High Court judge say that Australia owes a fiduciary duty to our Indigenous people. Want to get your thoughts?
Well, in the United States, we would say the states do not have that fiduciary duty. In fact, the notion in the United States, the reason this has been federalized, in many respects, one court famously said that the people of the states are the tribe's deadliest enemies. And so the relationship is a federal tribal relationship. It's not a state tribal relationship. States and tribes are sort of equal. The federal government sort of sits atop both of those. And part of the federal trust responsibility is protecting tribes and their authority from states that would encroach upon that authority. So it has been tested in court, and there are some fiduciary aspects of the trust responsibility, some of which have been recognized more in the breach than in the following, honestly. And that's why we have $10 billion of legal settlements in the last 8 years. Yes, ma'am.
When you talked about rights of way, you said go away and negotiate with the tribes. Can you just give us some idea what the process is and what happens when it gets to the pointy end when the negotiation's unsuccessful?
Well, if the tribe's not happy, nowadays the tribes have the veto right. They can say there will be no right of way. These are hard issues, and I'll tell you one of the reasons they're hard issues. Public utilities serve all of us, and one of the issues is that because there's a fiduciary duty to the United States, because it is technically the owner of that land, that trust land that's held for tribes, the United States has the duty as a trustee to get the best value for that land. And a tribe might say, we don't want to charge the public utility the full value of that land because we really want them to build this line across our land so we've got easier access to electricity or telephone or something like that. And so one of the things we did in our rule was we said if the tribe says we will charge nothing for that, that's okay. They've got control. Or if they say we don't want to have any right of way at all, they can say that. And so we've given we've given great deference to what the tribe's view is. In some circumstances, what it means is the public utility can build the entire line except for the small strip that crosses the Indian reservation, and the Indian reservation, the Indian tribe, therefore has a lot of power and may be able to get more than fair market value for that last mile or 2 miles or whatever it is of the right of way. And that's just sort of a fact of life that gives them a little more leverage. And leverage, we think, in the Obama administration, we thought they deserved. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about $10 billion of settlement fees and costs with the Obama administration. You mentioned that the important part was to give a way forward so that the Indian tribes could look forward. How important do you think it is to recognise those injustices, as someone put it, in order to move forward?
I think it's crucial. I mean, if people are dwelling on the injustice all the time, and if you've experienced, and frankly, it's crucial on both sides of the equation. It's crucial for the United States because the United States is kind of a fraud when it claims it's a just nation if it doesn't behave in a just fashion, right? And that imposes a wound on the identity and the psyche of the United States. But it also really distracts Indian people from moving forward, right? Because they're focused on the wrongs that have happened. And if you're human, if a wrong has happened to you, you are going to focus on it until it's been addressed in some way. I mean, this is why we have criminal trials, for example. The idea that a crime is a rip in the fabric of society that needs to be amended before people can move forward, right? I mean, that's, our governments, that's the way they work. And so it's really important, again, for both sides of the equation that we address wrongs that have happened in the past. Ultimately, they need to be addressed in some fashion. We've been trying to do it in the United States for years, and actually there was an Indian Claims Commission that existed from about 1946 into the 1970s that was supposed to hear Indian claims and adjudicate them and sort of make Indian tribes whole for what happened to them. Interestingly, though, there was some money that was paid out to tribes through that process, but the way the United States constructed the process was very adversarial. I mean, they constructed a litigation process, and by the end of it, tribes felt like they had fought for everything that they gained once again, and the United States really didn't own up to any of the issues, any of the problems, and so that was not a good way to solve these things. And frankly, the United States did some unfair things during that process, that Indian Claims Commission process. So, for example, if two different tribes had used certain lands, the Claims Commission would not let either one of the tribes claim takings as to that land because, well, more than one tribe was using it. And so, that was sort of unfair, but there were a lot of, it actually, the whole process kind of exacerbated unfairness rather than addressing unfairness. So you have to be really careful about how you do these things. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. I was wondering whether or not you've been privy to kind of discussions by tribal leaders on how to negotiate with Trump, right? So what are they thinking about him? And perhaps you're not able to really comment on those types of strategies, but I was just curious on their opinions and how to deal with someone who is kind of hard to anticipate.
Well, they're having trouble because they're having trouble getting any kind of access. I think that they are hopeful that he will carry forth the tradition of having an annual meeting with Indian tribes, but they're not inclined to think that he will do that. And he really doesn't have a government in place yet. I think I read in the New York Times today, I believe, that of around 500, 500 to 600 positions, kind of like at my level of government. Obviously, none of the rest of them dealt with Indian affairs, really, but at my level in government, there are a lot of positions for all kinds of different things. And he doesn't even have nominees for more than 400 of those positions. Not confirmed appointees, but not even nominees. He doesn't even have a name of an idea of someone to put in those positions. So it's still really early on. He hasn't named a person to fulfill my position that I left, and the Obama administration had someone by April confirmed through the United States Senate by April of his first year in office. So here we are in June, and he hasn't even nominated anybody yet. So I went through really quickly and was unanimously confirmed, but it still took about 2 months from the time the president named me and I was confirmed to the United States Senate. So that's considered super fast, 60 days. So we won't have an assistant secretary probably until late summer or fall at the earliest for Indian Affairs. So there's no one for tribes to talk to in many respects, and that's been a real problem because there's just no one, they could go knock on the door whenever there's a person appointed, but they don't have that person yet. So tribes are frustrated by that. Yes, sir.
How did the tribes feel about a Hillary Clinton presidency? Obviously, it's a moot point, but just interested to hear your thoughts.
They were very much in favor of. They did cast their lot to a large degree with Hillary Clinton. They passed it even greater with Bernie Sanders, and I think that a lot more tribes were excited about Bernie than they were feeling the burn. But they were ultimately behind Hillary. And Bill Clinton was a good president for Indian tribes. He was, I would say he wasn't a Barack Obama, and I served in government during the Clinton administration as well. So I saw him up close. I was at the White House for meetings and that sort of thing during his administration, and he was good. And I think that the thought was that Hillary would be, good. I think that there were a lot of Obama people that sort of signed on with Hillary campaign, and so they were hopeful for Hillary. Yes, sir.
I wanted to find out how the tribal governments are structured and how they recognize legally.
Well, they're structured very differently. So the Pueblos that we talked about earlier, the Pueblos, many of them are still very traditional, and so the way only men serve in government, and they've got, some of them have modernized and have women in their governments now, but the old traditional Pueblos, and several of them still function like this. The governor of the Pueblo, the highest official, is usually a young man who's never served in government before, and the council who work with him are all the former governors of the Pueblo. And so the council, the governor's kind of the weakest person there because he doesn't know how anything works, but the council members are all people who used to serve in his position. And so kind of interesting, right? I mean, it's a way to ensure that the voice of the people comes through, because the council has to, the governor's not going to really know how to do anything unless he speaks to the council. So, but some of them have democratic forms. Well, most of them have democratic forms of government rather than that approach. Most of them, there are many women serving in tribes as in leadership positions across the country. Some of them have tripartite form of government. Some of them have more of a prime minister system, if you will, where the chair of the tribe is one of the delegates. Is not necessarily runs at large, but is one of the delegates that gets elected by the other council members. They vary dramatically. I mean, it's kind of up to the tribe. A lot of them are very similar because, as I said earlier, the BIA drafted a lot of the constitutions for them in the 1930s, and they drafted sort of cut and paste constitutions. But many of them have modified their constitutions to be more true to their original way. And they do absolutely have status. They've got sovereign immunity in the United States, so you can't sue a tribal government, and if it takes action, it's immune from suit. So there are, they definitely have legal standing that gives them great powers in some respects. They can put people in jail. They can prosecute people and incarcerate them. That's legal authority. They've got legal authority in a bunch of different ways.
Not many would have that capacity, though, would they?
Well, a lot of them. So it's expensive to incarcerate people, right? And we spend a lot of money in the United States incarcerating people. Interestingly, one of the best influences, or one of the best ramifications of over-incarceration in the United States has been the budget impacts have been incredible. So a lot of state governments have actually really changed from the tough on crime approach to a smarter on crime approach because they just can't afford to incarcerate people. So incarceration is very expensive. I think the hope is that the more we empower tribes to deal with criminal issues themselves, is they will find alternatives to incarceration that are more consistent with their own values. Banishment is one that some tribes have used. You're just banished. You don't get to be part of our community anymore. And so they have been using different approaches to criminal justice, which is a good thing. Yes, ma'am.
What relationship, if any, does Indian or First Nations land law have on environmental law in the United States?
Well, so Indian land in the United States is federal land. It's federal public land. It is held technically by the United States government in trust for Indian tribes who are the beneficiaries. Because of that, federal environmental laws tend to apply when they want to do something on their land. And this is something that tribes are kind of upset about because they have, even if they have their own tribal environmental laws, they still have to report to the federal government and follow the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires environmental assessments of when, if you're going to do development or something like that. But state laws don't apply. So they work, they are subject to environmental laws, and they exist uneasily with those laws to some degree. Okay, I've got time for three more questions. Okay, yes ma'am in the back.
I was wondering, in your scholarship, to what extent you take a comparative approach with other jurisdictions and what value you think this has?
Well, it's extraordinarily valuable. I learn a lot by coming and talking to you all, and the conversations are invaluable. And so I think a comparative approach is very important. I'm mostly a critic of the federal government in the United States. Most of my scholarship has been explaining why the United States is not the answer to the problems in Indian country, that Indian tribes are the answer to problems in Indian country. And I use the word Indian country, that's a federal term in the United States, it's defined in the US Code, but it basically means Indian reservations and Indian lands. But that's, I'm a big believer in tribal self-determination and tribal self-governance. And so comparative law, interestingly, tribes do talk to one another quite a bit. And so they have been restoring a lot of their traditional ways of doing things and learning new ones, honestly. So they've been more flexible, and they sort of take a comparative approach in the United States. They work with one another to change their laws, and they seem to be open to that. Yes, ma'am?
I was just interested, you mentioned the 2013 Violence Against Women Act and the tribes prosecuting that in their communities. Can you talk about how that's actually working?
Well, about 10 or 15 tribes have started doing it. There have been a fair number of people prosecuted. There have been some acquittals. It's not, the non-Indian, even when a non-Indian is prosecuted, they sometimes don't get convicted, in an Indian court, and they're fair, in other words. It's quite controversial, and so this is one of the kind of things we're worried about with the Trump administration. When someone brings a case in the federal courts and brings it to the U.S. Supreme Court, is the Trump administration going to defend that action, or are they going to side with the non-Indian who claims that all of this is unconstitutional? And so there's some question marks going forward about how this will be litigated. It will go to federal courts. So one of these guys that gets convicted will challenge the case. And so we're going to wait and see how that works. But interestingly, the law requires that they have non-Indians serving on their juries. It requires, because that was a compromise the tribes had to make to get the law passed. And they've sometimes had trouble seating juries because they can't find a jury pool that includes a lot of non-Indians. There are non-Indians that live on Indian reservations. Interestingly, some of them are employees of the tribe, and so they've found ways to make it work. But it's very expensive. The American criminal justice model with public defenders, criminal defense attorneys that are paid for by the government, it's expensive. And so and then once you get them convicted, then you got to pay for incarcerating them. So not all tribes are going to be, some tribes will never be doing this sort of thing, but the ones that have really serious problems have this tool that they can use if they wish to use it, and it seems to be working on some reservations, the handful of reservations where it's happened. And interestingly, there have not been a lot of appeals. Some of these guys have, some of the people, it's not been all men, close to all men, but the defendants haven't necessarily appealed. Which suggests that maybe they think the judgment in the sentence was fair. All right, do we have time for one last question? Anybody? Well, listen, thank you so much. This has been a real honor to be here, and I'm returning back to you. Okay, back to Sarah Joseph. Thank you.